Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your ocularly obsessed host Kay, and tonight on the Darkheart Project, we'll be celebrating the anniversary of one of the most influential pieces of media this side of the Appalachian Mountains. A piece whose influence has been felt for decades. So check your high eights and don't you dare touch my map, as we get lost in the woods of the Blair Witch Project, and pay our respects to one of the greatest and most influential pieces of fiction in the genre. First debuting at the Sundance Film Festival in January of 1999, Blair Witch Project is a found-footage film focused on the story of three film students who, while shooting a documentary of the same name on the local legend of the Blair Witch, get lost in the woods and encounter a series of strange happenings, which culminate in their disappearance. The film would go on to release in theaters in July of the same year, earning almost $250 million. However, the money was nothing. What was even more important was the cultural impact. It's hard to describe secondhand what it was like at the time. Everyone had to see it, and what's more, they had to know if it was real. It was possibly the first time that a major film had deliberately tried to appear real. While not the first found footage, or indeed the first American found footage film, the Blair Witch Project managed to be something that no film before it had even thought to be, truly immersive. The Blair Witch Project brought Unfiction to the masses. The Blair Witch Project is a 1999 horror film set outside of the historic Civil War town of current-day Burkesville, Maryland. Not at all far, as my hometown is just across the river. The film follows three film students, Heather, Mike, and Josh, as they attempt to track down the so-called Blair Witch. The whole dreadful affair begins with the trio gathering up all their equipment and driving to the town. The next day, the trio interviews several locals about the Blair Witch and various other urban legends and folklore around the town. These opening minutes of the film do a great job to immerse the viewer in the authenticity of the film. It humanizes both the main cast as well as the residents of the town. The authenticity of these scenes does well to make the viewer forget that they are merely characters who cease to be the moment the cameras stop rolling. Now, please forgive me as I indulge my need to gush about one of my favorite films of all time. There's a scene early in the film which Heather stops to interview two men who are fishing at a creek. One man insists that one time he saw some kind of gray vapor rise out of the water, coil around a tree, and disappear, to which his companion turns to him and says something to the effect of, "You're full of shit," in the most offhanded tone imaginable. It's a small moment that doesn't impact the plot, and yet makes the film feel so much more immersive, an entirely realistic interaction between two friends that we just so happen to witness. While interviewing a number of locals, including the resident crazy or maybe not lady, the trio learns about a brutal series of child abductions that took place in the mid-20th century. 7 children were abducted and taken out to a cabin in the woods where they were murdered. Supposedly, the man responsible had stumbled out of the woods after the fact and proclaimed, "It's over, it's finally over." Particularly interesting is the detail that he killed them in pairs, making one child stand and stare at the corner of the room as he didn't like them watching. This man's name, as the trio would learn, was Rustin Parr. And this, my dear viewers, is where I must take a step back and shatter the illusion of our work here. See, initially my plan was to discuss the film in its entirety. However, I ended up deciding that I wanted to cover a less appreciated portion of the series. This video isn't really about the Blair Witch Project per se. Rather, I chose to sit down and discuss the less admired aspect of this story. That's not to say the websites and extra footage are never discussed, but I felt that considering the anniversary, I should focus on something a bit more obscure. As both the websites I'll be discussing have a lot of content, I will not be individually breaking down each page in detail. Rather, I'll be giving an overview of each page, followed by a summary of each site. Sound good? Good. Now, where were we? Ah yes, Rustin Parr. Oh, and one more thing. All the sites I will be discussing were located with the help of this user's post from the Blair Witch fan forum. If, by some miracle, you're listening, ARC, thanks for compiling all those sites. Now, The first website we'll be taking a look at consists of journalist Chris Karzakano's writings for his piece Rustin Parr, Never Given. It remains unclear if these writings were, in canon, intended to become a book of some kind, or if they were always meant to remain a website. Regardless, Karzakano writes about how he was fascinated by Parr's case, and that he uncovered evidence that caused him to have misgivings about Parr's trial and execution. The first section of Karzakano's writing focuses in on Parr's life. Parr apparently had a relatively normal childhood, having been born at the turn of the 20th century. However, early in life, he lost his twin brother before soon losing his parents. Into his young adulthood, Parr was living in the neighboring town of Burkesville with his aunt and uncle. He would end up becoming a recluse in the Black Hills forest surrounding the region, building a cabin out in the woods and eventually disappearing from public life almost entirely. Apparently, Parr was struck by madness while deep in the Black Woods because he began to hear a woman's voice. At first, it was just in his sleep, but then it would go on to be at all times of the day. It was about this time that children would begin disappearing from the Burkesville area. 7 of those children would be found murdered in the basement of Parr's cabin in the Blackwood. Karzakano, interestingly enough, notes that, quote, "The police involved in Rustin's arrest and interrogation claim to have Rustin's confessional statement, 'I'm finally finished.' However, there's no recorded evidence of his confession and no police transcript signed by witnesses claiming to have heard this statement." Additionally, quote, "The only known time Rustin was to claim that he heard voices was at a public press conference that I believe was arranged for and manipulated by the police. The statement he made during the press conference appeared to be visibly forced and notably influenced by the days of police interrogation leading up to this appearance." Even more interestingly, only one young boy survived these events. A boy named Kyle Brody. While Parr only had a few brief video clips and a couple of speculative text blurbs, Karzakano has an extensive amount of research on the topic of Kyle Brody. Apparently, Brody was the thread connecting all of these disparate children, as he knew all of them, despite none of them knowing each other. He was even able to give the police a detailed account of the kidnapping of Emily Hollins, who disappeared sometime before he did. Despite the fact that this small child was clearly suspect, the police would accept his story, and Brody was widely considered the reason that Parr was ultimately convicted. It would seem that, after Parr's execution in 1941, Brody's life did not meaningfully prove in any way. According to Karzakano, all of Brody's records prior to his 18th birthday were sealed. However, Karzakano did find information indicating that Brody's childhood was troubled. So, it would come as no surprise that Brody spent much of his adult life getting into trouble with the law. Karzakano also compiled this helpful timeline to chronologize major events of Brody's life between 1941 and his death in 1971. At multiple different points in his life, Brody would find himself in the Maryland State Institute for the Criminally Insane, even being extradited there after a stint of legal trouble in Florida after he had, presumably, train-hopped down the coast. Now, this detail would be irrelevant if not for White Enamel, a documentary that was shot in the 1960s at various asylums around Maryland, including MSICI. Kyle Brody actually appeared a number of times in White Enamel, and the information contained within is rather interesting. Quote, "The first clip from the asylum's recreation room shows Kyle Brody writing on a large pad. As the camera gets closer, it becomes apparent that what he's writing is..." Look, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. I have no idea how to pronounce it. The witchcraft language. This is a very rare language, yet Kyle is seen writing it correctly from right to left. I had this footage examined by an expert who determined that this was indeed the witchcraft language based on the style in which Kyle wrote and the distinct circular embellishments of each character. This is significant because it was the same language found on the walls of Rustin Parr's house and originally presumed to be written by Rustin. This footage led me to conclude that Kyle was responsible for the markings on the walls. It is highly unlikely that Rustin could have marked his walls, as he was unable to read or write in the English. What the fuck? Why is it? That's a typo on the website, by the way. I want you to know that I'm reading directly off the website. It is highly unlikely that Rustin could have marked his walls, as he was unable to read or write in English. Kyle, on the other hand, was educated and had an extremely high IQ. The second clip contains footage of Kyle in his cell repeatedly chanting the phrase, "never given." There is documented fact that the guards who watched over Rustin Parr the night before his execution witnessed him screaming, "never given, never given." Though I am uncertain exactly what this phrase means, this establishes strong connection between Kyle Brody and Rustin Parr, and implies greater involvement of Kyle in the murder of the 7 children from Burkesville. Unquote. The last page on the website simply contains a link to a 40-minute long companion piece documentary about the Burkesville 7. This, according to my research, aired as a separate piece of media, and as such, I will not be discussing it here. However, I will leave a link to the Reupload down below if you'd like to look into it for yourself. With that, we've concluded our look into Rustin Parr, Never Given, a well thought out, if peculiar look at the world surrounding the Blair Witch. But that's not all we have for you tonight. No. Tonight's showing is a double feature. However, the second site is a bit less interesting and quite a bit more fragile. This is the website located at blairwitch.com, or rather, it was the website available at that domain. See, this website has had a very difficult time staying up even before 2033, and it was known to simply vanish for periods of time. Now, when trying to access it through a GridNet-compliant browser, the connection just bounces. Even using a cracked browser that allows historical view, the site is mostly broken, unfortunately. For instance, if we were to visit the Mythology tab, which gives us a handy overview of the storyline before and after the ill-fated filming trip, we will find that of the 14 hyperlinks on this page, less than half are able to execute properly. And keep in mind, this data capture is from 2020. The earliest I could find with a working copy of town.html was August of 2016. Thankfully, it seems that at least the rest of the timeline hyperlinks were archived in 2016. So, while editing, we actually realized there is a preserved version of BlairWitch.com linking through Haxon's own website, so yeah, we're not running it on an emulator anymore. Look, BlairWitch.com has hundreds of web pages to trudge through, and to tell you the truth, most of them are pretty boring. Most of the content is grainy, low-resolution images, about half of which are in black and white. The rest is audio and video, mostly of interviews of what happened. The website runs like piss, and is hardly designed for hardware of the 2010s, let alone now, and will frequently take seconds at a time to load only a very simple page. Yes, I know this is due to the fact that the site is being emulated through an archive, but the website has not been available for years at this point. I'll be honest, I have no goddamn idea how many pages there actually are here, nor how many individual files there are to download, so I'll cut you a deal. I'll discuss all of the text and image-based stuff, and I'll leave the rest of the videos and audio for you to go check out on your own time. Sound good? Good. Let's get into it then. We begin on the Mythology tab, more accurately called the Timeline. This timeline lists every major event of the lore leading up to October 1997, and Haxon Films' acquisition of the tapes to create what we now know as the Blair Witch Project. Story begins in 1785, February, with the children of the Blair Township accusing Ellie Kedward of, quote, luring them into her home to draw blood from them, unquote. She was found guilty of witchcraft and was abandoned in the Black Hills Forest, where she's presumed to have died. By November of the next year, all of her accusers, as well as half of the other children of the town, had disappeared. This led townsfolk to assume there was a curse on the place, so they fled, vowing never to speak her name again. Nothing happened for another 23 years. Then, in November of 1809, The Blair Witch Cult is published. The book was considered to be fiction and tells the tale of a small town cursed by an exiled witch. Apparently, the book is exceptionally rare, with only one privately owned copy known to exist. CJ? Is it in the show's budget to get a copy of the Blair Witch Cult? So no? It's not? Fuck. The excerpts taken from the Blair Witch Cult mention two things that are worth noting. They mention one, Ellie Kedward, who was the witch said to have cursed Blair. There was also mention of, quote, several puppets made up of sticks and rags and hog bristles, unquote. For those of whom have seen the film, you will know why this little detail is so important. However, for those of you who haven't, the events in the Black Hills Forest are underlined by one thing: this design of a crude triangular effigy made of sticks lashed together. I believe this is the puppet in question, the iconic symbol, the insignia of the Blair Witch Project. This symbol is all over the film and its marketing, so it being a puppet that is closely linked to Ellie Kedward only makes sense. Sometime, a decade and a half after the publishing of the Blair Witch Cult, the town of Burkesville is founded on the site of Blair. According to the website, the town has a population of 194, a number that has only declined in the years since. A more recent assessment pegged the population at 140, a 28% decrease. If you couldn't tell already, Burkesville is a nowhere town, to the point that it's officially listed as a village in the state of Maryland when searched for. Things begin to get weird in August of 1825, as 11 people claim to witness a pale woman's hand pulling a young girl into Tappy East Creek. For weeks after this happened, oily bundles of sticks would be found in the creek, rendering the water undrinkable. This, once again, lends credence to the experiences of our film crew 175 years later, as, when one of the trio seemingly vanishes into the night, these same oily bundles of sticks turn up not long after. Things would not get better from here, as less than a year later, a young child named Robin Weaver goes missing. Search parties swept the area, and although Weaver returned, one of the search parties also vanished. Their heavily decomposed remains were discovered at Coffin Rock. These 5 men were found bound together at the hands and feet. Their bodies had been gutted and strange markings carved into their faces and hands. Upon the discovery of these remains, the other search parties quickly went back to town for help. However, upon returning to Coffin Rock, all the corpses had vanished. And that is all the events we've yet to see. From here on in, we'll be entering the lightning round, recapping Parr's murders and the actual events of the Blair Witch Project. November 1940 to May 1941, a total of 7 children are kidnapped from the Burkesville area. May 25th, 1941, Rustin Parr walks into a Burkesville market and declares that he's, quote, finally finished. He's arrested and police make the 4-hour hike to his cabin deep in the Black Hills Forest. In the cellar, they find the septuple murder, each ritualistically butchered like those bodies found at Coffin Rock almost 200 years prior. Parr confesses to everything, claiming that he did it for the, quote, old woman ghost, unquote, who lived in the woods near his house. It's worth mentioning that this site has a lot more details of the case. They have a whole page of text just dedicated to talking about the killings, if that so interests you. October 20th, 1994. The film students arrive in Burkesville and interview various locals on the legends, including the local crazy lady, Mary Brown. October 21st, the trio interview a pair of fishermen before hiking into the Blackwoods Forest. They are never seen again. October 25th, APB issued, Josh's car is found, abandoned, along Black Rock Road. October 26th, Maryland State Police launch a manhunt in the Black Hills area. The operation lasts 10 days. At its peak, the operation utilizes 100 officers, with additional support from K-9 units, helicopters, and Department of Defense satellite imaging. November 3rd. After 33,000 man-hours, the search is deemed a failure. Heather's mother, Angie, begins her own search for the film crew. June 19th, 1995, the case is declared cold. October 16th, students from the University of Maryland's Department of Anthropology discover a duffel bag full of tapes and film equipment buried under the foundation of a 100-year-old cabin in the woods. Upon examination, the Burkesville sheriff announces that the contents of the bag did indeed belong to the filmmakers. December 15th, select clips of the footage of those film reels and tapes are shown to the families. There are several instances of bizarre happenings, according to Angie. February 19th, 1996, the families are shown another curated collection of footage. These clips draw much suspicion from the sheriff's department. Angie goes public with her condemnation of the department, and Sheriff Cravens seals the footage. 2 lawsuits fail to lift this. March 1st, Sheriff's Department announces that the case will again be shelved. The footage is to be released with the families as soon as the clock runs out. October 16th, the footage is finally unsealed and turned over to the families. Angie contacts Hacks and Films to reconstruct the trio's footage of their final days. And with that, we've come to the end of the timeline. Sometime, 3 years later, in 1999, Hacks and Films would complete their work, and the Blair Witch Project would be released to the public. While it may seem conclusive, there's still a few miscellaneous things on the website to discuss. Flipping through the Aftermath tab, we can find pictures of Josh's car as it was found on October 25th, as well as pictures of the duffel bag as it was recovered from the cabin in the woods. We can also find pictures of the infamous missing posters that were said to be handed out during the film's first screening at Sundance 1999. The Filmmaker tab contains nothing of interest to us and is merely various pictures of the trio. As the actors had their real names attached to this project, I assume that these are real pictures of them at various points in their lives. There is nothing of any interest here. Lastly, and most fittingly, we conclude on the Legacy page. This section mostly contains video and audio. However, it does contain a transcript of Heather's journal. As it's exceptionally long, I will not be reading it here. However, it largely just provides some background on her character and effectively serves to novelize the events of the film. And with that, we've come to the end. As I mentioned previously, there is still a large quantity of video and audio content across both sites that I choose not to cover for the sake of brevity, as well as to give those of you who enjoy the films but maybe haven't seen the websites an excuse to check them out. Or maybe you've never seen the Blair Witch Project and you'll go track down a copy now that you've heard me discuss it. Blair Witch Project, in my opinion, is something special. It started a renaissance of found footage horror, and yet nobody seems to acknowledge the fact that it's almost certainly a major contributing factor to the internet horror explosion that would be seen almost 10 years later. The idea of a piece of media being made immersive, to the degree that the Blair Witch was unheard of at the time. To this day, it still sits in a category entirely its own, a testament to the fact that a decent premise and some clever guerrilla marketing will bring you success beyond your wildest dreams. So remember that. You don't need a big budget or famous faces to sell your horror project. All you need is a little bit of creativity. And more than that, I hope I've inspired you to perhaps try your hand at making something like the Blair Witch Project. At the end of the day, that's all I make these videos for, to share something I enjoy, in the hopes that you will be inspired to make something out of it, much as I was inspired by those I enjoy. Regardless, that's all I have for you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do leave a like, and consider subscribing and enabling notifications. And with that, I'm Kay the Darkhearted, and I bid you all a good night.